In my video, Coronavirus Politics, I mentioned that the WHO had announced a global death rate of 3.4. Globally, about 3.4 of reported COVID-19 cases have died, and that President Trump said he thought that number was false. Well, I think the 3.4 is really a false number. So in order to establish the facts, I explained in my video how the figure was derived. The figure is correct because it's simple maths. The number of deaths at the time of the study divided by the total number of reported cases. That's the number of people who tested positive. It's known as the case fatality rate, or more colloquially, the death rate. But judging from the posts on the forum, not everyone got it. So I'll try to make it easier to understand, this time with analogies and illustrations. Let's start with the claims that the figure was known. Well, it was known because it's a simple matter of dividing two numbers for a given population on a given date. About 3.4 of reported COVID-19 cases. And at the time of this statement, the number of reported cases worldwide was 98,192. And the number of recorded deaths was 3,380. Just to make sure the WHO got their sums right, I did the calculation myself. 3,380 divided by 98,192 and multiply by 100 to give you the percentage. That gives you 3.44, or 3.4 to 1 decimal place. So the figure was right. Epidemiologists call this the CFR, or case fatality rate. It's not measuring all the infections or all the deaths. It's only measuring the reported cases and recorded deaths. And that was clearly spelled out. So the honest scientific answer is not, we don't know. The honest scientific answer is 3.4. The only way that number can change is if the number of reported worldwide cases and recorded worldwide deaths up to March 3rd were revised. But so far they haven't been. I think one reason for people's confusion is that they assume they're just one number, one definitive cur. In fact, there are many. As I explained in the video, if you sample global figures at a different time, the cur would be different. So, for example, up to September 22nd, the cur was 3.1. Or if you focused on just one part of the world population, like Denmark, the figure would be different again. I explained that the cur will vary from country to country because it's dependent on a number of variables, such as demographics, quality of health care, and so on. To use an analogy, it's a bit like giving world ticket sale figures for the movie Avengers Endgame up to May 3rd, 2019, as a percentage of population. Let's say 50 million people saw the movie. Out of a world population of 7 billion, that would be 0.7. The percentage of people in Spain who saw the movie during the same period would obviously be different. And the percentage of the world who saw the movie on a different date would be different again. You can't say we don't know the global figure up to May 3rd or that it's an estimate just because ticket sales for different countries on different dates are, not surprisingly, different. I'm going to anticipate a flood of posts here along the lines of, we can't be sure that all the deaths are due to COVID-19. Some people might have died of natural causes. But because they coincidentally had COVID, doctors just put it down to COVID. So that number is an estimate, which means the CFR is wrong. Firstly, the number in this equation is the number of deaths, but the number of recorded deaths attributed to COVID-19. Of course, the fatal conditions it causes, like cardiogenic shock, septic shock, multiple organ failure, or respiratory failure, could have happened anyway that same day. And that's probably true in some patients. But in most cases, if the patient had contracted COVID-19, he or she might have continued living for another 10, 20, or even 60 years. The best way to measure that is something called excess mortality, the number of deaths above the seasonal average. And this shows something surprising. The number of excess deaths in the Cook and the USA is actually higher than the number of recorded deaths due to COVID-19. So if we take the excess mortality divided by the number of cases, it actually comes out as more than the CR, not less. Most of the posters, though, thought the CR was wrong for another reason. They were mixing up the case fatality rate with the infection fatality rate. For example, imagine a thinking 3.4 was the real CR because you assume that all cases were recorded. But of course the CR doesn't assume all cases are recorded at all. It assumes they aren't recorded. That's the point. You will never record all the cases unless you've tested every single person in a population every single day. Since that doesn't happen, epidemiologists have to estimate the total number of infections. And when they divide the number of deaths by the estimated number of infections, that doesn't give them the CR, it gives them something called the IFR, the infection fatality rate. In fact, the WHO explained this back in February. While the CR in China at that time was 2.3, the IFR was estimated at between 0.3 and 1, and they explained it again in March. The data we have so far indicate that the crude mortality rate, the number of reported deaths divided by the reported cases, is between 3 to 4. The infection mortality rate, the number of reported deaths divided by the number of infections, will be lower. If the reason still isn't clear, I'll explain the difference with a simple illustration. Let's say the 12 people in orange are those who've been tested positive for COVID-19. They read the number of cases. 2 of their number died as a result, and they remarked in red. So 2 out of 12 is therefore the case fatality rate, the CR. And simple maths tells us that that number in this illustration is 16.7. The sample size is statistically significant, but this is just for the purpose of illustration. Now let's say there were another 17 people somewhere among the population who had the virus, but their symptoms were so mild they never got tested. So they obviously don't show up as cases. We don't even know how many there are. But epidemiologists can estimate their number through various methods. Let's say their estimate is 16 people, which is pretty close. We'll show them in yellow. If we add those 16 to the 12 others who were recorded, that makes a total of 28 suspected infections. It says, to work. Specto, the So now if we divide the number of deaths, 2, by the number of suspected infections, 28, we get the infection fatality rate, or IFR, which in this example is 7.1. Some people thought that my IFR figure of roughly 1 was wrong in the earlier video because they've seen different figures at different times for different populations. So let me stress again that just like the cur, there's no single infection fatality rate. My figure of around 1 isn't the result of sloppy research. It's the estimated global figure for that particular time period. Of course, it's going to be different for South Korea and it's going to be different for Wuhan. Most IFRs lay between 0.5 and 2 depending on the population, the quality of healthcare and so on. And the reason I say about is because even the figure itself is an estimate. The exact number of infections, unlike the number of cases, is to known. The illustrations show why there's a huge difference between the IFR and the cur, and why confusing the two very different measurements can mislead you into thinking epidemiologists have made a mistake. Some posters gave away the fact that they were confusing the cur and the IFR by referring to uncounted cases. Others gave it away by the low figures they cited. I mean, obviously the global case fatality rate wasn't on March 3rd or 0.5 or 1.2 or lower or less than 1 or 0.5 to 1.6, unless my math is shockingly bad. So where do those figures come from? Coincidentally, they all within the range of estimates for various infection fatality rates, which suggests that these posters, like the president, have confused the cur with the IFR. One poster even said that if I played more of the president's interview, I'd see that he was talking about the figure for uncounted cases. Yes, I know, that's the infection fatality rate, which is why he was clearly confusing the two figures. That's why his claim was wrong. You can't argue that a figure for a case fatality rate is false simply because you've mixed it up with a completely different measurement. I hope those people who didn't understand the difference do now get it, but we'll see. My bet is that the next response will be, well, it doesn't matter anyway. After all, you can't expect a politician to know the difference between the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate, even if they are completely different. That's just splitting hairs. What he means is that only one of people infected will die. But here's the problem. If the President of the United States, not just this president, any president, wrongly believes that the figures he's hearing from scientific bodies are false, that can lead to policy decisions based on his beliefs rather than actual data, sometimes life and death decisions. And if he goes on national television and, based on that misunderstanding, tells people who epidemiologists are exaggerating the severity of a virus, a lot of them will believe him, as we've seen from these posts. And that leads to a distrust in science and complacency. That's why the media needs to fact-check claims by government leaders and report the correct figures. Whether or not you believe that me giving the correct figures will lead to panic, or you think I am being disrespectful or treasonous, as in other countries when leaders are fact-checked. But a lot of people do want to know the facts, and I think they have every right to know, don't they? My thanks to all those who donated to the charity Health in Harmony, which I've asked you to support as a way of supporting me channel, which of course isn't monetized. Donations from people who follow me channel have now exceeded $100,000, which is fantastic. It's allowed the charity to expand their health care for forest protection into Madagascar and now into the Xingu region of Brazil. Details are in the video description if you want to know more about this innovative and very effective charity.